Hello everyone, I have some sad news. This is the last part of this fanfic because the writer has decided as of 2013 to stop creating more chapters of this story. If you want more fanfics then please subscribe to my channel and watch to the end. The Straw Hat Pirates ran towards the train station where the train was about to leave. The wind was strong now, indicating that the Aqualaguna was close. Luffy was munching on the sandwiches from the lunchbox that Robin had left in the small house, and for once, nobody commented on or even minded his horrific lack of manners. He needed it too. He hadn't eaten since breakfast and with Luffy, that's life-threatening. Well, maybe not for him. As they passed a few houses, Luffy thought of something. By the way. He began. He literally swallowed one of the sandwiches. Everyone looked over to him. How did you find me? Zoro smirked. He pushed something into Luffy's free hand as they ran. Luffy blinked in confusion and then looked at the paper he was given. His eyes widened slightly, but then he smirked as well. Why you bad girl, he thought. Written on the paper was the full address of the house where he was locked. This fell out of her pockets when she was leaving. Nami said, confirming Luffy's thoughts. But Chopper's nose also helped a lot. I see. He said aloud. Then he felt a familiar aura nearby. They ran over a small bridge that extended across the water. From the left, the shipwright Polly ran with a few of his shipwrights. He was wounded and his blood had stained his clothes, but he was apparently still in the shape to run around. Somehow. Hey, guys. Polly called. So you found him, huh? The Straw Hat smiled at him. Nami did a thumbs up. They joined them and started running alongside them. So where are you going now, Straw Hat? Polly asked. Luffy gulped down the remaining food and threw the lunchbox away. Did the sea train leave yet? He asked afterwards. The shipwright gained a thoughtful expression. Well, it was supposed to leave at 11, but I have no idea what the time is. He said after a while. Things have been a bit rowdy. I see. Luffy replied. Then he sighed. He could see Nami was getting a bit tired from running. Chopper too, but it was less apparent. Well, there's no sense wasting time running there. He said after a moment. Everyone looked at him oddly as they ran. What do you mean? Polly asked in confusion. Everyone nodded, thinking the same thing. Luffy stretched his arms, wrapping his left arm around the crew members and his right around the shipwrights. They all got the feeling something terrible was about to happen. Hey, what are you? One of the shipwrights began, but he was unable to continue as Luffy jumped. Nami screamed. The men did the same. In close to an instant, they found themselves a few hundred meters in the air above the houses. Luffy kicked the air, keeping himself up there. What the hell? Everyone yelled together with razor-sharp teeth. I jumped. He said simply. Everyone looked down and freaked out when they saw what kind of distance he had covered. So, where's the train station? He asked nonchalantly. TT there. One of the shipwrights announced in a shaking voice and pointed with his finger. Luffy dashed into that direction. After he touched down and dropped the scared guys on the ground, he immediately ran towards the station. It had 3 entrances. Above the one in the middle was a large sign saying station, so he was pretty sure it was the correct building. He chose the central entrance. He missed the stairs leading downwards, so he accidentally rolled down them. The rest of them followed him down, although Nami had to grab Zoro to prevent him from going in the opposite direction. The place was already filled with water. Luffy barely stopped himself from falling into it by grabbing the walls with his hands. Stop! He yelled to those behind him. They obeyed him. He put his legs back on the ground. Then he turned around and ran back to them. The place is filled with water. He told them. They must have already left. Nami and Chopper got a look of panic while Zoro tried to keep his composure. But we can't just let her. Chopper began with tears forming in his eyes. We won't. Luffy reassured. We'll find a way. But for now we need to get to higher ground. But, Luffy, Nami started. He's right. Zoro said calmly. First we need to make sure we are safe before we can make any plans. Luffy nodded. Guys. Polly shouted. Everyone looked up the stairs. I found something. He yelled. It's a note from one of your crew members. They ran up the stairs. How did you manage to? She began, but then she noticed a big writing with a big arrow pointing down a pillar. To make it worse, everything was also in pink. Nami-san. Read this. Don't read if you're not Nami-san. You're all shitty jerkasses. Oh my god. Luffy said in a deadpan voice. Who is he calling a jerkass? Zoro snapped. Nami bonked him on the head. Anyway, hand me the note. She said with a tic forming on her face. Polly complied. As she read Sanji's hopeless love letter with a little bit of information that talked about Robin boarding the train, Chopper tugged at Luffy's cardigan. He looked down. Luffy, why is Sanji always so much nicer to girls? He asked innocently. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Well, Chopper, you see. Because he's a dumbus. Zoro interrupted. Luffy snickered. Well, that works too. He replied. But Sanji was always taught to be nice to girls, so that's why. Zoro snorted. My explanation is better. He said. Anyway, guys. Nami interrupted. Sanji is on the train, so there's at least that. And we have a baby Den Mushy if he calls us. Luffy sighed. Okay. That's good. And Frankie should also be on the train. He said. They looked at him in confusion. He noticed that. Well, he might help Sanji since they're in this together. Luffy said. Guys. Polly called again. Everyone looked at him. He had a look of horror on his face and was looking in the distance where the wave was approaching. Let's go. Luffy said. He grabbed everyone with his rubber hands and jumped in the air again. He landed on the Water 7 district at the top of the city. He dropped everyone on the grass. SS scary. The shipwright stuttered. Polly just stared at him and panted. Soon afterward, the first wave of the Aqualaguna hit the city. What the hell was that? Zoro asked as he panted. That's Aqualaguna. Polly replied. And it's not over yet. It's big. Luffy said. Zoro snorted. That's an understatement. He said. Luffy nodded. Then he heard some commotion behind them. People were crowding around a tree near the now no longer burning mansion. Luffy recognized some of them immediately. Frankie's guys, he thought as he looked at their black outfits, which he still thought were hideous looking. He could feel Zoro tensing beside him. He walked over to them. Leaning next to the tree was a heavily bandaged iceberg. What do you mean taken? The man who appeared to be in charge, the same man who was responsible for beating up Usopp, yelled. The iceberg gritted his teeth in pain and sat down next to the tree. CP9. He said simply. They nearly killed me and they took Frankie. The men gasped in horror. That means. They're taking him to Enies lobby. Iceberg said solemnly. I'm sorry, but there's not much we can do for him. The man noticed Luffy. Straw Hat. He called. Frankie's goons turned around in fear. Luffy walked over to him. So, they found you? He said simply. Luffy nodded. There was silence for a few moments. We're going to Enies lobby. Luffy said. The man's eyes widened in shock. He stared at him for a moment. The Frankie family had similar expressions. Are you crazy? He asked quietly. Luffy just stared at with a determined look. Iceberg signed. Then he slowly stood up. Well, if we don't give you any help, then you'll just get yourself killed. He said. Then he looked around until his gaze settled on someone else. They saw a familiar old woman walking towards them. Alongside her walked Chimney and Gomb. Nagagagaga. What a crazy night. She sat and drank some wine from the bottle. Oh Iceberg. You're okay. Iceberg. Chimney greeted. The woman stumbled and nearly fell flat on her face, but she stopped herself in time. Kokoro-san, Chimney. Nami greeted with a small sweat drop. The woman turned their attention to them. Ah, it's you guys. She said. What are you doing here? Nami asked her. The old woman gulped down more of her alcohol and laughed. Nagagaga. Did you expect me to stay on the station during the Aqualaguna? She asked with amusement in her voice. She turned back to Iceberg, who was slowly walking towards her. What's that look for, Iceberg? He sighed and looked at her. These guys, he pointed at them. Want to go to Enies lobby. She blinked a few times and then started laughing. Nagagaga. You're a bunch of idiots, you are. She told them. The Straw Hats took offense to that. Hey, we can't just leave Robin to sacrifice herself for us. Chopper yelled. Nami nodded. We have to go after her. Luffy yelled, although he already knew that the woman wasn't really mocking them. That's right. Chopper agreed. Zoro simply nodded in agreement. She looked at them, studying their resolve while gulping down her drink. Then she stopped drinking and laughed again. Yosh. Then I'll take you there. She announced loudly. Everyone fell down in I'm style. Wow, that was one quick 180. Luffy thought as he picked himself up. Wait, guys. Someone yelled from behind Iceberg. Everyone turned around. Luffy inwardly grinned as he saw who it was. It was the same man who had beaten up Usopp, the second leader of the Frankie family, Zambai. If you're going to Enies lobby, then please take us with you. He said. Luffy had a soft smile on his face. What do you mean? Nami yelled. How can you say something like that after all that you've done? That's right. Chopper agreed. Usopp is still hurt. The man dropped on his knees. Please. The man begged with tears in his eyes. Others followed his example. I know what we did and bearing that shame, I beg you. Please save Aniki. That settled things for Luffy. A few minutes later. Nami and Zoro went with Kokoro and Iceberg. By the way, how are we going to get to Enies lobby? Nami asked as she followed after Kokoro. "There's another sea train," Kokoro answered. The Frankie family went to get a lot of food and drink for the Straw Hat Pirates. That was Luffy's condition for letting them join in the attack. Luffy and Chopper went to the ship. The reindeer knew the way and he could find the rest of them with his nose afterwards. As they arrived in the garage, Luffy noticed that they had carried the gold and money off the ship in case it would break down. Chopper quickly explained everything to Usopp, who was now up and about, while Luffy quickly ran into the men's quarters to change. He dropped the dirtied red cardigan and replaced it with a blue Hawaiian shirt which he left unbuttoned. Then he looked in the drawer. He took out the object he wanted to test for some time now. The reject aisle. He grinned. He placed it on his right palm and then put a black glove on the hand. Given its immense power, it fit surprisingly well in his hand. Then. Captain, a childish voice called. Luffy looked around, but then he remembered what it was. "Mary," he whispered. "I want to help my crew, Captain." The ship answered him cheerfully. He sighed. "If you do this, Mary, you'll die," he said quietly. The voice laughed. "Silly Captain, I'm going to die regardless," it answered. Luffy's eyes widened. The full force of that statement hit him in the face like a ton of bricks. Mary would die and there was nothing he could do about it. Not again. He thought. Tears started gathering in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Captain." A few minutes later the crew gathered in the sea train garage. The Frankie family brought them the supplies. Finally, they set off. The sea train crashed down on the ocean water and after that, Frankie's goons, with their own ship and 2 king bulls, Sodom and Gomorrah, violently attached themselves to the sea train from the back. Usopp didn't seem too comfortable with seeing them with them, but he didn't comment on it. After this, everyone had a near heart attack and Kokoro instantly sobered up upon seeing that Chimney and Gon were on top of the sea train along with Luffy. They would have fallen off if Luffy hadn't rescued them when the train reached the tracks. Along with the 3 shipwrights that had stowed away somewhere on top of the train. "Ah, we nearly died," Chimney said as everyone sat down inside the train. "You're damn right," Kokoro said scolding. "Didn't I say it was going to be dangerous?" My, that sure surprised me," the shipwright Tilestone replied. "My back hurts," the shipwright Lulu said. "Wait a moment," Zoro said sweating. "I see some new faces here." Tilestone and Lulu looked around in fake confusion. "Where?" they asked. "He means you dimwits," Polly yelled at them. "And you too," Zoro yelled with razor-sharp shark teeth. The shipwrights explained that they were going to fight no matter what anyone said, so that was the reason why they boarded the train. Then Polly proceeded to explain to them who the CP9 were, which shocked them. "Oh, no." Nami screamed as she looked through the window. "Aqua Laguna." Luffy ignored her as he stepped forward towards the rest of the guys. "Well, then the Frankie family and the Galley La shipbuilders," he began. Everyone looked at him. "We might be going in the same direction, but it'll mean nothing if we don't work together." They nodded in agreement. "You're right," Polly admitted. Luffy took another step forward. "Luffy?" Nami yelled in panic. "The Aqua." Luffy ignored her completely. "Let's not have a big wave scare us," Luffy continued. They looked at him intently. He extended his arm forward. Polly and Zambai stepped forward, extending their arms as well. Polly grabbed Luffy's elbow, Zambai grabbed Polly's, and Luffy grabbed Zambai's elbow. Their arms formed a triangle. "We're allies now." Luffy opened the window of the sea train. He looked through it and then stretched and grabbed the top of the train. He jumped up and headed for the front. The wave was nearly upon them. "Hey Luffy." Zoro called from the train. Luffy turned around. "Need any help?" Luffy grinned. "Nah, just nap, Zoro," he said cheerfully. Polly and some others who were shooting at the wave nearly fell over upon hearing this. "He was napping," Polly yelled with his eyes bulged out. Luffy laughed. Shishy. Zoro likes to sleep," he replied. "That's not the issue here," the shipwright yelled. Luffy just laughed. Then, after a moment, he turned to the wave and turned serious. He unsheathed Tomorrow's Sorrow and grabbed the hilt tightly. "I haven't used you in a while," he thought. "Armament," he murmured. His right hand blackened, thought it wasn't so noticeable now that he wore a glove. The black color spread to the hilt and then the blade. "What are you going to do?" Polly asked in confusion. Luffy raised a katana in the air. "I'll make a path," Luffy said quietly, but the man heard him. He stared at him in confusion. "Saioi Akainami, strong red wave," he yelled and slashed forward. A huge crimson flying blade attack traveled towards the wave. When it hit the water traveling towards them it exploded in a flash of light. When the light cleared, a huge hole in the middle of the wave greeted them. Luffy blinked a few times. "That's a lot bigger than I remember it," he thought. He stared at it for a moment but then he shrugged and turned around. What greeted him were pale as wall faces with bulged out eyes and snot coming out of their noses and jaws hanging low. He blinked but then he smirked. He raised his sword to represent a certain pirate's Bacento and straightened himself up. Ahem. Guerrera. Snot-nosed brats. He said in his best Whitebeard voice. When he received no reaction, he pouted and walked forward to return inside the train, but he was stopped in his tracks when Zambai and the other men from the top of the train rushed towards him and bowed deeply. "We're sorry for causing you trouble." They all said at the same time. Luffy blinked and tilted his head to the side. "You know I'm not the one you should be apologizing to," he said quietly. They looked up to him. "You made me angry, but Usopp was the one you hurt." They raised their heads. "I understand," Zambai said. Luffy smiled. "Whether or not he forgives you is his choice," he continued. "But I'll consider us good as long as you apologize." The leader sighed in relief. "Okay," he said. "I swear we won't do anything like that again." Luffy grinned. "Of course you won't," he said cheerfully without changing his tone. "If you did, I'd break all the bones in your bodies." The men nodded but became as pale as a white wall again. They found cheerful death threats much scarier than his glare. Luffy returned to the train with the men following him. They immediately rushed towards Usopp to apologize, but Luffy blocked their voices out when he heard Nami calling. "Luffy," she yelled. "It's Sanji-kun." He walked towards her and took the baby Den Den Mushi. "Hi, Sanji," he greeted. "Luffy." The Den Den Mushi greeted simply. "Nami filled me in the situation. Robin is still being held captive. I heard what happened." Luffy grinned. "I see," he replied. "By the way, is Frankie with you?" The Den Den Mushi shook its tiny little head. "I left him in the train after I kicked him a few times," he said. Luffy's sweat dropped. "A fine few," he said. 20-ish. The Den Den Mushi replied. Luffy's jaw dropped low. "Anyway," he said after a moment. "Go free him." "Why?" the snail asked with a confused voice. "You need all the help you can get," Luffy told him. "Besides, Frankie's guys are helping us." There was a pause. "Go as wild as you like." The other sea train was in front of them. Or rather, 2 cars of the sea train. Luffy rocketed himself into it, breaking through its roof. He looked if Sanji was anywhere. He knew Sanji probably wasn't on it, but he checked anyway, but he wasn't, so he told Zoro to cut them in half. Which, he did. Then, the swordsman fought with the ship cutter and defeated him. More easily than the first time. They were on edge. Luffy as well. He sat on the top front of train. Then he saw something in the distance. He jumped into the train. "Hey guys, the frog that does the front crawl is on the tracks," he told them. Everyone looked at him oddly. "The frog that does the front crawl is on the tracks?" Chopper asked curiously. Luffy nodded. "So, the frog that does the front crawl is on the tracks," Zoro said in a grave tone. Zambai looked confused. "The frog that does the front crawl?" he asked. Luffy nodded vigorously. "I see. Nagagaga," Kokoro said. "Yokozuna is on the tracks." Zambai seemed to understand now. "Naya," Gomb said. Luffy nodded with a grave expression. "Why are we repeating the stuff about the frog that does the front crawl?" Nami asked in confusion. Usopp sighed. "I don't know why we're talking about the front that does the frog crawl either," he said irritated. And then they crashed into it. Yokozuna joined them on their journey after a bit of convincing by Kokoro Basin. After a while, the Straw Hats and their allies came across the sea train with a lone inhabitant Sanji, who told them that the only reason he survived was because of Robin convincing the CP9 to not to kill him. He looked roughened up. Frankie was unable to escape as the CP9 was unwilling to let him go. However, unsurprisingly, he was left alive. The joined fighters began making plans to fight. Luffy however had his own plan. He rocketed himself to the island of Enies Lobby as soon as it came in sight. Luffy rocketed towards the city where night never falls. Just as he was about to crash on top of the first gate, he kicked the air beneath him to prevent any noise. Then he landed softly on the ground. He looked in the direction of Enies Lobby, the island that seemed to be floating above a giant hole. There was another gate that he had to pass in order to get to the city itself. He looked at the city. It had many buildings, but he recognized the one he was headed for immediately as it had the flag of the government, plus it was bigger than the others. He sensed around with his observation hockey. Robin and Frankie were at the building with all of the cipher pull. It seems they were all together, along with someone who was actually weaker than a normal foot soldier, but had an exceptionally malicious aura about him. He smirked. "They're making no attempt to move," he thought. "They're too arrogant. If they knew what was coming for them." He walked forward until he reached the edge of the building. He looked down. There are no soldiers down there," he thought. Then he jumped down. The force of the fall made the ground beneath him crack a bit. He ran towards the other gate until he saw the marine soldiers. He slowed down and started walking. 2 of them at the front walked in his direction. "Hey, little guy. Where you going?" one of them asked. The other smirked. "Don't you know where you are, buddy?" he asked. Luffy pouted. "I'm not little." He thought, but didn't voice it. Instead he grinned. "Hey, Marine-san." he greeted. "Do you have any matches?" He stopped just in front of them. They looked at him oddly. "What are you even doing here?" the first one asked. "How did you get in here?" Luffy stick his pinky in his nose. "Well, I was just minding my own business when a bunch of jerks playing secret agents came and kidnapped my archaeologist," he said. "So I'm going to get her back and burn the city to the ground." Then he grinned brightly while the two Marines gaped at him with bulged out eyes. Then he took his straw hat that was hanging from his neck and pushed it on his head. The two Marines paled even further. "Why you're the first one," stuttered. Luffy narrowed his eyes at him. "I'm?" he asked. Why you're the second," repeated. Luffy blinked a few times. "I'm what?" he asked them. They backed away slightly and raised their guns at him. "SS surrender, SS straw each had L Luffy." The first one stuttered out. Luffy pouted. "No," he said in the most childish manner he could muster while sticking his tongue out. They started firing. Luffy jumped up in the air, avoiding the bullets and kicked them towards the other, each with one of his feet. The men behind them all raised their weapons and started shooting at him. Luffy just ran towards the panicking Marines and unsheathed his sword. A few of them ran towards him with their cheap Marine katanas raised. Luffy dodged a slash from the first guy by moving slightly to the right and then kicked him in the back with his left leg. He put the katana in front of his face, blocking a slash. A few bullets hit him, but he made them bounce back at whoever shot him. He kicked the man whose sword he had blocked in the crotch, making the others wince and send the said man flying somewhere in the gate. 3 Marines roared and jumped towards him with raised swords. He jumped up in the air, avoiding their swords. He was hit by more bullets and he bounced them off somewhere. When he landed behind them and they turned around, he used his Gomu Gomu no Muchi technique to whip them, sending them tumbling on the ground to the left. He turned around and faced the pale Marines who kept shooting at him. "Stop doing that," he yelled in annoyance as he bounced back more bullets. They dropped their guns and unsheathed their katanas. They were obviously scared as they began backing against the giant Enies lobby gate which stood behind them. One of them was trying to dial somewhere with his baby Den Den Mushi. "Hey guys," Luffy called as he walked slowly towards them. They looked at him fearfully. "Just let me pass." "Don't be ridiculous, pirate." One of them yelled and charged towards him. The rest followed. Luffy ducked, avoiding the blade and slashed him across the chest. He sheathed his katana and jumped in the air. "Gomu Gomu no Gatling." He yelled and unleashed his attack, punching every Marine except for one. He landed on the ground. The Marine he spared the punch was gripping the hilt of his katana tightly with both of his hands in front of him. He gulped, but then he raised his katana and let out a battle cry. He ran towards Luffy, but the pirate stopped his sword with 2 of his fingers. The Marine struggled and tried to get the sword out of the pirate's hand, but he couldn't. Pirate." The Marine spat out, although it sounded very half-hearted since he was so overwhelmed. "You know," Luffy began. The soldier looked at him. "I never would have come to this island if you didn't provoke me first." He stared at the pirate. "I never attack anyone without a reason," Luffy continued. "Pirates don't need reasons." The Marine spat out as he continued to struggle in vain, incapable of budging the sword an inch. "Get out of the way," Luffy told him. He pushed the Marine away along with his sword. The man just stood there panting and sweating when Luffy jumped on top of the second gatehouse. Luffy landed on top of the second gatehouse. He could sense 2 relatively powerful people nearby. He remembered what happened last time and had to conclude those were the 2 giants that had helped them fight here. Just how did Usopp manage to convince them to join us last time? He thought. I don't remember. But it didn't matter. They weren't doing anything to hinder him, so he'd just let the others deal with them like they did last time. What to do now? The auras in the tallest building made no indication of movement, so Luffy concluded that he had time. He looked down on the city. Marines were running around yelling stuff. It seems the other Marine had informed them someone was coming. Too bad I don't have any matches or anything, oh well. He thought. He sensed around with his hockey. He didn't think there was anyone capable of sensing his hockey on this island, but he had to be sure. He was right. The strongest man on the island, aside from him, was Lucci, and although his Rakishiki fighting style was deadly, he had no hockey to speak of. He grinned. "Armament," he mumbled. His right fist turned shiny black, although not that much difference was visible since he was wearing a glove. Then he activated Gear Second, localizing it on his right hand. Steam surrounded his hand and after a while, it burst into flames, although it didn't damage the glove since hockey was protecting it. He put a bit more hockey in it so it affected the flames. He pulled the arm back and quickly punched a random building underneath him. Then the arm quickly snapped back. He had to suppress a laugh when the Marines nearly shat themselves when a building seemingly randomly collapsed next to them and caught on fire. He ducked behind the conveniently placed battlement on the gatehouse. What happened? One of the Marines asked while looking around in panic. The others weren't much better. Who did this? Another asked, slightly more calmly. A few of them carefully approached the now burning ruins of the building and looked around for any signs of hostiles. They found nothing. They must have been confused since they kept looking around and tried to spot something, but they never saw anything. Of course, if anyone bothered to look up, he'd notice a fiery hand gripping the battlement and the head of the young pirate who was grinning evilly. Although the Marines were obviously still on edge, they were calming down slowly. Luffy saw that. He heard some of them saying something about the building not being built well or badly maintained or something like that. He looked around. There were a few Marines on top of some of the taller houses. He slowly stood up. "I did it," he yelled aloud, scaring everyone and making them look at him. He waited a little so most of them noticed him and then used his Soru and quickly jumped down in the midst of them. Where did he go? Many of them asked as he disappeared. "What are looking for?" he asked childishly. "He's here," the ones around him yelled. They backed away and then raised their swords and jumped towards him to attack. Luffy jumped in the air and landed on a random Navy soldier and stood on his shoulders, although he was facing the other way. "Get off, filthy pirate," the soldier underneath him yelled. Luffy raised his right foot and kicked him in the face. "I'm not filthy, stupid Marine," Luffy yelled at him. The Marine tried to shake him off and then tried to cut his foot, but Luffy just lifted his leg to avoid it. "What are you standing around like this?" the man yelled at his comrades. "Shoot him." They obeyed his command and those that had guns raised them. They started shooting. Luffy jumped in the air and landed on building. He punched through the roof with his flaming fist and then jumped to another, doing the same. There was a Marine on the third building and he nearly shat himself when Luffy landed in front of him. The pirate simply grabbed him by the uniform with his left hand as he tried to attack. "Hey," he said. What?" the Marine stuttered. Luffy grinned. "Where's your meat?" he asked him. The Marine's eyes bulged out upon hearing such a question. What?" he asked. Luffy sighed. "Where's your meat?" he asked again. The man gulped. He pointed at one of the buildings. Luffy looked at it. It was a bit bigger than the others, although it had the same overall plain-looking brown design. He briefly wondered why the government would build such ugly housing for the Marines, but he dismissed the thought. "Thanks," he said simply. "Why, you're welcome. Luffy threw him off the building on top of some Marines. Seeing as he released the man, the Marines now started shooting at him again. He bounced off the bullets, punched the building and jumped off. He landed between the Marines again. The closest to him backed away from him, leaving a small circle of space around him. One Marine, somewhere in the back, started laughing. What are you going to do, Straw Hat?" he asked mockingly. "There are 10,000 soldiers here in Eni's lobby." It was obviously a half-hearted attempt to return morale to the obviously shaken army of Marines. Luffy had to give it to them. There were a lot of them there. They were everywhere he looked. But he wasn't worried. "And I'm alone," he said simply. "So you'd better get out of my way." He cracked his knuckles and took a step forward. He raised his still flaming fist. They flinched and sweated, but stood their ground. "Attack!" one of them yelled, obviously a higher-ranked Marine, since he was wearing a fancy green suit with a tie underneath a Marine coat. He gripped his sword and ran towards Luffy. Others followed. Luffy simply jumped up and used his Soru. He punched a few more buildings with his right fist with the help of his, as he called it, super cool devil fruit ability. He didn't touch the Marines yet. The Marines ran around in panic as more buildings collapsed around them. Some looked ready to pull their hair out. Luffy landed on the roof of the building that was supposed to be the restaurant or something to that effect. If the Marine hadn't lied, that is. He pouted as he looked at the town. They only start burning after they are already down. He thought and shook his head. Well, whatever. He deactivated his gear second technique and relaxed his right hand, making the armament disappear. He jumped down from the building and entered it. Marines noticed and followed him inside. A few jumped at him, trying to attack from behind, but Luffy just kicked them towards the rest of the guys. The restaurant looked very simple. The floor was made from wood. The tables were long, and both the tables and chairs were simplistic in design. The food was still on the tables. Some of the Marines were obviously called out to defend during their meals. Drool leaked from his mouth as he approached the many large tables in the big dining room. "Meat," he mumbled. The Marines who were cautiously walking behind him blinked in confusion and looked at each other as the pirate ran towards the tables and started devouring the food on them. 3 of them ran towards him with their swords raised. "Meat punch." Luffy announced and sent them flying towards the door with a big piece of meat on bone, his favorite. Most of the marines moved out of the way, but a few were unable to. He brought more food to his mouth and ate it all. More soldiers attacked him. "Meat stab," Luffy said and stabbed one of them with a piece of food, sending him flying in a wall. Then he ate the meat. One of the marines, the one who seemed to be in charge, looked at Luffy with bulged out eyes and a face fault. He's beating them with food. He yelled as Luffy used another piece of food to send his marines flying. One of them crashed into him. After a few more short moments, Luffy was done eating and walked towards the exit with a bulging stomach. "Ah, that was good," he said in satisfaction. In all honesty, the food wasn't nearly as good as Sanji's, but it was food. "Damn pirate," one of the marines spat out. Luffy closed one of his eyes and looked at him skeptically. The marines would have to stop being so repetitive. "Go away," he said simply while walking towards them. When no one would budge, Luffy stretched his arms behind him and started running towards them. Seeing him on the offensive again made them nervous, although a few of them still ran towards him to fight him. "Gomu Gomu no," he started. 5 marines with raised swords ran towards him. "Bazooka." He finished and hit the central one, but his attack didn't stop there. He dodged the blades of the other 4 and kept running, pushing the poor soldier effortlessly towards the other marines until he finally got out of the building. As he did so, he stopped and snapped his arms back. He looked at the big pile of marines on the ground who were mostly unconscious. His lip twitched. "Hey guys," he chirped out childishly. "They'll catch cold if they sleep on the ground. You were the one who knocked them out." Hundreds of marines yelled at him with razor-sharp shark teeth while slapping the air. Luffy laughed. "Shishi. You guys are so funny," he said cheerfully. Then his smile fell and he looked at them with a serious expression. Suddenly, he bowed slightly. The marines looked at each other in confusion. "Please let me pass," Luffy said semi-politely and looked back up. "Like hell, pirate," one of them yelled. The others repeated the same or just gripped their weapons. "Oh, come on," Luffy yelled. "No," they yelled. "Pretty please?" he asked. He got the same answer. He lowered his head so that the hat now hid his eyes, making him look intimidating. "I see," he said in a more serious tone. "I understand." He jumped high in the air. "Gomu Gomu no storm," he announced. "Crap." A member of the CP9, Blue Eno, watched from the top of the last gatehouse as the Straw Hat Pirate demolished more and more buildings and beat up hundreds of marines in mere seconds. His eyes were wide. He obviously did not expect this. He heard some reports about a few marines getting beaten up and Straw Hat then disappearing. After that, the boss must have somehow disconnected the Den Mushi again. The idiot boss assumed it'd be completely fine to leave things as they are. He supposed his faith in the marine weaklings versus the highly wanted pirate was cute but utterly moronic. It was of no surprise, of course, as Chief Spandam himself was a weakling and had no idea how far apart a regular soldier was from the Straw Hat captain. Even if Nico Robin's assessment of the captain's strength was an exaggeration, which he believed it probably was, since she probably never met someone as strong as the superhuman CP9 for example. Even then, the pirate should have been taken more seriously. The ease at which he dispatched the marines was quite unnerving to the man. The agent of the CP9 sighed. "I may have to handle this one myself." The marines were dropping like flies under Luffy's punches. Luffy was just messing around and wait for Nakama to appear. He saw 2 giants somewhere in the distance, apparently fighting. "It's time," he thought. He activated his Soru and, ignoring the marines completely, dashed towards the 3rd and final gatehouse. To his surprise, he already felt the aura of his first opponent on the top of it. The agent of the CP9 was already waiting for him up there. More marines appeared in front of him. Even though they were complete weaklings, he found them rather annoying. They'd constantly shoot at him or run up to him with their swords raised, thinking they'd be the ones to succeed where so many others had failed and take his head. I was getting old, but he couldn't simply use his king's hockey on them. The marines might have been weak and stupid, but he was sure someone would realize how dangerous he truly was if he showed it. And he couldn't have that. Not if he wanted to save anyone. He ran past the many marines. They didn't even notice him as he disappeared past them. He finally reached the courthouse, which also acted as the final gate, and jumped on top of it. He came face to face with one of Robin's kidnappers. "Well then," Blue Eno began. "This is certainly a surprise. This is the first time something like this has happened ever since the formation of the world government." He looked past Luffy at the ruined city. "To have a man attack the city that leads to the entrance the world government," he continued. Luffy smirked. "There's nothing to be surprised about," he replied. "You kidnapped my Nakama and I'm responding." The man looked at him with an unimpressed expression. "You and the others seem not to understand this," the man told him. "What you did here, what you're still doing here." He paused for a moment. The sounds of fighting could be heard in the background, as well as a yell that Luffy recognized belonged to Sanji. This is a great offense to the world. He continued after a moment. Across the world's oceans, we have influence over more than 170 affiliated countries. When you decided to invade this island, you also declared war on those 170 countries, as well as the entire force of the world government. Luffy grinned. That's right. He replied. But I only attacked because I was provoked. The man snorted, although he kept his face expressionless. It was impossible to see emotions in Blue Eno's face. You're at best a dozen people. He answered. Luffy didn't bother to correct him on that. I doubt you can even leave this island alive, but even if you did, you wouldn't continue living for long. The government would put its pride at stake and make sure you are hunted down. So, why are you still talking to me? Luffy asked in honest confusion. I'm pretty sure your stupid little government wouldn't forgive me, even if I turned back right now. There was silence for a few moments. You're only wasting your breath. He said after a moment. The man sighed and shook his head. Very well. He said after a moment. Sorrow. The man ran towards him in breathtaking speed. Or what would have been breathtaking speed to a normal man. He jumped in the air, using the air-walking technique called Geppo. He jumped several times in the air and then dashed towards Luffy with a fist ready. The index finger was extended. It seems he intended to try to finish Luffy quickly. The pirate smirked. For the most amazing assassins in the world, they sure waste a crap lot of energy. He thought. He grabbed the assassin's wrist. This didn't stop the man as he sliced the air with his left leg. Luffy simply jumped in the air to avoid, and when he did that, he pulled the assassin with him and then threw him down. The man stopped his imminent crash by kicking the air beneath him. He used Geppo to reach the position where Luffy was and then tried to punch him. Luffy stopped the punch with his own, and although he was holding back a lot, the CP9 member was still blown backwards. He stopped by kicking the air behind him and glared at the pirate. This can't be happening. He thought nervously. The pirate landed on the gatehouse and smirked. He heard yelling and fighting behind him. The main force was getting closer. Why don't you just get out of my way? Luffy suggested with a big grin. The assassin ignored his words and dashed forward. Rankyaku, storm leg. He announced and released several compressed air blasts towards his opponent. Luffy jumped in the air, avoiding them again. All without losing his grin. The assassin used Geppo in combination with Soru, and soon he was above him. He tried to kick Luffy down into the building, but his leg was blocked with an obviously lazily raised hand, which wasn't even in a blocking position. In fact, Luffy looked sort of like he was stretching, but with only one hand. Both men dropped on the ground, although there was a small distance between them. They stared at each other for a few moments. Luffy picked his nose. Then he raised his leg in a familiar position. Blue Eno's eyes widened in shock. No, it can't be. Luffy noticed his horrified stare, and his grin widened. Rankyaku. He announced and sliced the air with his foot. The compressed air blast flew towards the assassin, who quickly jumped out of the way. He stared at the pirate's leg in shock. He just mastered one of the Rakishiki techniques. Luffy put his leg back on the ground. He grinned again. Shishi. Why are you so shocked? He asked the gaping agent. This isn't really hard to do as long as you kick fast enough. This is bad. He thought. It feels like he's toying with me. He hasn't even attacked yet. He jumped back in the air using his Soru, kicked the air a few times, and flew towards Luffy with an extended fist at high speed. That guy. He announced as he attempted to crash down into his opponent. Luffy jumped out of the way and kicked the man into his gut. Blue Eno was sent flying away, but he stopped himself by kicking the air again. He spat out blood and looked at Luffy in disbelief. Doa. He announced and opened a simple door in the ground using his devil fruit ability and jumped into it. After a moment, two tiny doors opened underneath Luffy's feet. The CP9 agent attempted to grab his feet, pull them in and make them stuck in the ground, but before that could happen, Luffy jumped up in the air. Seeing that he failed, Blue Eno created a bigger door underneath Luffy and jumped up, heading towards Luffy. He attempted to punch his opponent, but he only hit air as Luffy successfully dodged every blow. I'm sorry, but this is really boring. Luffy said after a while of dodging the blows. He caught the next punch with his right palm, powering his dial. The desperate agent attempted a Rankyaku slice, but he just deflected it with his other hand. Blue Eno then tried to stab him with his index finger. Luffy caught his wrist with his left hand. The man felt immense pressure. He tensed his entire body, effectively activating Tekai. But it wasn't enough. He screamed as the pirate broke his wrist. Then he released him. Maybe you should play a pirate next time. Luffy suggested coldly. He looked at his broken hand in shock. What is this man? He thought, panicked. How is he dominating the fight so effortlessly? I'm an agent of CP9, not some common marine. Then his eyes widened in realization. Flashback. Don't try to intimidate me. Not even the four of you together could take the captain, let alone the whole crew. She was right. He thought. He looked past Luffy in absolute panic. Behind him was the Enies lobby main building, where the CP9 and Chief Spandam were. I need to inform Lucci. Victory here is impossible. The only option is to run. Run and hope to survive. He glanced at Luffy nervously. The pirate was scratching his head with a bored expression. He kicked the air multiple times. He blasted off towards the main building, running on air using his fastest possible speed. Thankfully, only agents of the government can use the air-walking technique. He thought. He looked behind him. The pirate had turned around and looked after him. Stop! Luffy yelled. He didn't obey. He was halfway across the gap between the two buildings, running using his fastest speed. He sighed in relief. Good, now he can't. He was in front of him. Kicking the air below him with his right foot and both of his hands in his pockets. Smirking. The agent stopped and looked at the other man, horrified. And just where are you going? Luffy asked with a wide smile. The agent looked at his legs with widened eyes. Ah, this? Luffy asked and looked below. He smirked again. Guess you shouldn't have showed me all those tricks. He enjoyed the look of terror on his opponent's face. In his opinion, he deserved it. Even though he had learned both Zoro and Geppo long ago, he deliberately made it seem as if everything was his fault. All to make the mistake seem even bigger. The assassin punched him across the face with his undamaged hand. He didn't bother to dodge. A second before the fist connected, he covered his cheek with armament. His head didn't move. The man retracted his fist and just stared. It felt like a hit steel. He thought, but he wasn't allowed to keep thinking for long as he felt a hand on his chest. What are you doing? He asked in a panicked voice. Luffy looked him in the eyes. You should have chosen your opponents better, CP9. He said simply. He looked at the agent. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Reject. Luffy whispered. He pushed the palm of his right hand to the assassin's chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, he felt immense pain. It was as if someone had punched him through the stomach. From the inside out. He thought his innards were going to burst apart. He crashed into the top of the gatehouse, but that pain was nothing compared to what he was feeling upon being hit with the dial. He coughed and spat out blood. He tried to pick himself up, but he was unable to move. Luffy was watching from above with widened eyes. He felt nothing after he used it, but it was clear that his opponent was unable to continue any longer. That was powered with one of his own punches. He thought. If I used my own there'd probably be nothing left of him. After a moment, the man collapsed completely and fell unconscious. Luffy jumped down and inspected the damage. The man had blood all over his body. Luffy thought that he might make it though, if he's lucky. He sensed around with his observation haki. His crew members were just about to come up and the CP9, along with the two prisoners, were still in the Grand Tower of Justice. He grinned. He also felt intense fear coming in waves somewhere from the top of the grand building. He turned around and faced it. The fear became even greater. The weakling boss. He thought. Now that he's not in control anymore, he's afraid. Good. He looked at the tower for a moment, trying to find where the man was looking from, but he was unable to. Then, at the next moment, his nakama came crashing through the ground. Nami and Chopper were both sent flying up from the courthouse by Zoro's reckless tornado-like attack. The swordsmen soon climbed after them and got mercilessly scolded by the navigator. Soon afterwards, Usopp came flying from somewhere below and crashed down on the rooftop, and Sanji kicked through the ground. Luffy grinned. So, finally, everyone's here. He thought joyfully. He could still feel fear from the top of the judicial tower. Lucci. Someone yelled from above, loud enough that everyone heard him. Go get Lucci. Luffy smirked. Oh, so the boss is afraid. He thought in amusement. His nakama slowly came and joined him at the edge of the courthouse. He took a deep breath. Robin. He yelled at the top of his lungs. We came to get you back. He felt great now that all his nakama were side by side with him. He glanced at the one closest to him. Usopp. Despite the situation they were in, he seemed unafraid. He, along with everyone else, stared defiantly at the grand tower. For a few moments nothing happened. Then he heard commotion from the tower. An explosion, followed by a crash. Then, the iron fence fell from the balcony on the tower. They heard some panicked yelling, but after a while, everything calmed down. Straw Hat. A familiar voice yelled from the tower. Everyone looked up and saw the unusual figure. It was Frankie. Flashback. Hey, Luffy, check out my new super invention. He grinned. Beside him was the one they came to rescue. Yosh. Luffy called. Robin. Of course, he was glad to see Frankie was alive and well, but he was not one of them yet, so he didn't voice it. Robin hesitated. More than anything she wanted to just get this over with. Because they were the first that protected her, the first that offered her a home, she wanted to protect them in turn. Protect them from herself and the darkness that followed her. "What are you doing here?" She yelled in an angry voice, but one could also hear desperation in it. "Why did you come here?" Every Straw Hat member was taken aback by her words. They stared at the top of the tower. "We came to rescue you, Robin," Luffy replied without hesitation. He could see the black figure at the top slightly shaking. "I've told you before," she yelled from the top. "I'm not coming back. I don't want to see you here. Why did you come for me?" Frankie, who was currently dealing with the small fries that were attacking them, turned around and headed towards her. "When did I ask you to save me?" she continued to shout. "I never asked for such a thing." She closed her eyes in pain and took a deep breath. "I only want to die," she shouted. Although he expected to hear them, Luffy was still startled by the words. They also reminded him of someone else. Another one of the demons. Flashback. "Gramps, was it good that I was born? I don't deserve to live. You want me to live? One with such worthless blood in his veins. Thank you for loving me." Frankie stepped up to her and started shaking her by her shoulders. "What nonsense are you saying?" he yelled in disbelief. "Just let them rescue you." In that moment, Luffy felt a few powerful auras approach. The CP9 appeared from below the balcony, using Geppo to get up there. "I don't believe you," Luffy shouted from below, for now ignoring the agents. She hesitated again. He heard Frankie yelling something at her, but he blocked it out, only focusing on her. The Straw Hats observed the CP9, each trying to find his opponent. "They passed through Aqua Laguna to come here," the only female of the group commented. "If you think about it, it's amazing." Dabber snorted. "They're lucky, that's all," he said. The strongest of the group, Rob Lucci, smirked. "This time we have permission to kill," he said in anticipation of the incoming fight. "We'll get to see if the captain is as strong as he was advertised to be." The chief ran to the balcony, unafraid now that his assassin's group was here. "Oh CP9. He commanded loudly. "You have permission to annihilate them, but attack them from this tower of justice." They didn't respond, but they always followed his orders, so he wasn't worried about that. "The first priority is my life and then my promotion," he thought. "I have to make sure I'm protected. The pirate might have defeated Blueno, but Lucci has a Dariki of 4,000. With him as my bodyguard, I'm sure I'll be safe." He turned back to the pirates. He laughed. Luffy's eye twitched. He only heard him laugh and he already hated the man. "Wahaha. Uteko, octopus, pirates," he yelled loudly. Luffy face-palmed at the insult. "Even if you try your hardest, there's nothing you can change in the end." He laughed some more. "We have the invincible CP9. He shouted. "And behold, he raised something high in the air. At this moment I hold the authority to use this golden den mushi and call on a buster call." Luffy snorted. He was extremely tempted to ask the chief if that was supposed to scare him, but he knew that same attack had destroyed Robin's home island and many others. He did not wish to mock her fear of it. So, he remained silent. "The buster call?" Robin asked with widened eyes. Spandam grinned mockingly, although the pirates couldn't see that. "That's right," he said in an arrogant voice. "Exactly 20 years ago, it was the power that crushed your home island." His grin widened. "The name O'Hara, it disappeared, didn't it?" he continued, enjoying her fearful expression. "Robin's homeland," Chopper repeated. Sanji cursed the chief for tormenting Robin with this. "Stop it," she yelled at him. "Anything but that." He jumped up on the top of the railing. "Nice reaction," he told her. "It gives me chills." He showed her the den mushi. "Does that mean you want me to push this?" he asked mockingly. Robin gritted her teeth. Luffy down on the gatehouse growled. "That bastard," he thought as his eyes twitched in anger. "Don't you understand what will happen if you press that button?" Robin asked him, a bit more calmly. He smirked. "I do," he said. "It's simple, really." He moved his finger close to the button on the golden snail. "I press this," he said in a low tone. Pirates disappear. This both angered and panicked the archaeologist. "It's not as simple as that," she yelled at him. He chuckled. "Wahaha. Oh, are the memories flowing in?" he asked mockingly. His finger went closer to the trigger dot. "Then, shall I press it for a little test?" "No," she yelled. "Stop that." His face darkened in anger because of being yelled at. "It's a ruthless power that loses sight of the target itself," she yelled. "You can't use it." "Not ever," she added silently. The members of the CP9 glanced at her. They were surprised. Faced with the power of the government's most vicious attack, she was left to beg. Kaku and Khalifa in particular seemed unnerved by this. It was obvious that she was being overwhelmed by her horrible memories of the past. "If you trigger the attack here," she continued, Eni's lobby will be destroyed, and so will all of you. Spandam seemed confused by this. What kind of crap are you saying? He yelled. As if we could be hurt by an ally attack. You don't understand. She said softly. The attack doesn't discriminate. She looked up at him with a pleading look in her eyes. 20 years ago, it took everything away from me. She continued. Everyone was killed. The attack was supposed to finish those that study the poneglyphs, but they killed everyone. Everyone seemed startled by this, except Luffy who already knew all this. She stepped towards the railing. And now that same attack has shown itself here. She yelled. Aimed at the Nakama I love. No matter how far I travel, the darkness will never cease to follow me. It's a gigantic enemy I can never shake off. My enemy is the world itself. Luffy glanced at the flag of the world government that seemed to mock him from the top of the tower. Odd, I hate that flag. He thought. But Akiji, and this time too, I've already involved you in this twice. She continued to yell. If this continues, no matter how kind you all are, someday you'll see me as a burden. Someday you'll betray me and throw me away. If that's what's supposed to happen, I'd rather die right now. The Straw Hats were startled by her words. Luffy was a bit hurt by the words of mistrust, but he figured that due to her past, she couldn't bring herself to trust anyone again, regardless of how she wanted to. Besides, this was the second time this was happening. It seems her fear of the Buster Call is too great. He thought. It's what traumatized her for her whole life, it must seem like an invincible nightmare to her. He glanced at her face sadly, while the chief began to laugh. It's her own hell, like Marineford is mine. He thought. He sighed and closed his eyes for a moment. The chief was sprouting some crap about how she was right and that only an idiot would take her in, but Luffy ignored him. He opened his eyes. Usopp? He asked in a loud childish voice, interrupting the annoying panda. Don't you think that flag is really ugly? The sniper as well as everyone else who stood by him smirked, catching on what Luffy was saying. Yeah. Usopp said with a huge smirk. It's hideous. Being a great artist myself, I can't stand to even look at it. Ugh, I know what you mean. Sanji replied. It hurts my eyes. Damn right. Zoro said, for once agreeing with him. Same here. Nami said and smiled. I guess it is kinda stupid looking. Chopper said, completing it. Luffy smirked. Let's burn it. Luffy said loudly. The people on the balcony looked at them astonished. What? Both Robin and Spandam shouted at the same time, although Spandam looked like the stereotypical snot-nosed brat from Whitebeard's description. Roger that. Usopp said. He used his new weapon, Kabuto, to send a large fire projectile into the flag. The initial attack completely destroyed the world government's cross symbol and a gigantic ring of fire spread above them. What remained of the flag burned to ashes. No way. Robin whispered. The remaining marines below them shouted in disbelief. The chief seemed ready to pull his hair out. Are you crazy? He yelled. Don't think you'll survive having the world as your enemy. Bring it on. Luffy roared from below. Humph. If they knew who my father was. Robin was trembling. Tears gathered in her eyes as memories flooded her mind again. Robin. Luffy yelled. I still haven't heard it. Say you want to live. Tears slipped down her cheek. She finally realized it. They were her nakama. Saul was right. It was a long time she had searched for people to accept her as their own, and she has finally found them. If I'm allowed to declare my wish, she began silently. Then. I want to live. She yelled at the top of her lungs. Take me back to the sea with you. All the Straw Hats grinned at that moment. With pleasure. Luffy said softly. He glanced at his crewmates. Usopp was shaking next to him. I'm so excited ICC can't stop shaking. He stuttered out. Luffy grinned. In the next moment, they could hear the bridge lowering, but the allied forces were unable to lower it completely. He groaned in annoyance. Why can't it go more smoothly this time? He asked himself in irritation. The judge below and the chief were yelling something at each other. He noted that the chief was getting ready to start his retreat. He smirked. There's no way I let them go this far this time. He thought. But then the chief stopped. Luffy looked in confusion. Frankie, what is he? The cyborg held out a set of old-looking papers. The chief, Spandam, stopped in his tracks. Those he began. The cyborg let out a chuckle. It's the real thing. He said. Lucci, Kaku, you guys can probably tell. He raised a few of the pages and quickly showed it to them. Their eyes widened. Spandam, of course, demanded the plans for himself, but Frankie simply ignored his demands. Luffy briefly wondered why the CP9 didn't just restrain him and take the plans. Did they actually believe Frankie was going to give the plans to them? Or they simply didn't care until they received actual orders? Like a Robin. Frankie said. We've talked for a bit and I really don't believe that you are the demon that they all say you are. He looked at the chief. Spanda. He addressed him. What Tom-san and Iceberg tried to protect with their lives is a means to resist against the power of an ancient weapon should it fall in the hands of a total idiot like you. Shut up. The boss yelled. Give them to me. Frankie sighed at being interrupted. If that were to happen. Frankie said loudly, showing his irritation. Then this weapon would need to be built to resist that. The designer's wish is to contain a reckless outbreak. Luffy, down on the gatehouse, gained a thoughtful expression. The ancient weapons. He thought. The world government wants them, the world government fears them. Flashback. As the only person in the world capable of reviving the ancient weapons, Yonkou Robin is one of the greatest threats to the world government. Pluton. It is said that it is capable of destroying an island with one blast. He smirked. Good to know. He snapped out of his thoughts just in time to see Frankie burn the blueprints. So if I would happen to get the weapon now, there'd be no way to resist it, The Straw Hats cringed when they heard their captain's evil cackling. Luffy just got an idea. He turned his attention back to the balcony. At about the same time, Kokoro Basin told them to jump into the waterfall, and Frankie got thrown down the balcony by a furious panda. Hey Usopp. He whispered to the sniper. Tell the others to deal with the CP9. I'll go after Robin. He nodded. What about me? He asked, though he sounded a bit panicked, obviously dreading Luffy's words. Well. Luffy began. You should go to the top of the tower and clear the way forward. Snipe any marine in sight. The sniper nodded. He released a breath he did not know he was holding. He feared he was going to be ordered to take one of the CP9, who all seemed way above his level in fighting power. If you need help getting there, ask one of the others. He finished. Luffy then stretched his arms around his nakama as he heard the train approaching. Shishi. Let's go jumping. He said cheerfully. He jumped into the giant hole at the bottom and pushed his nakama down at the same time. That monster granny is as insane as us. He thought as they landed on the sea train, which was by now very beaten up. He face faulted along with the others as Frankie landed crotch first on the front of the Rocket Man and was then pushed by the train towards the giant steel, closed gate of the Judicial Tower. See ya. Luffy said just as they were about to crash. Yeah. In the meantime, on the top of the tower, on the balcony, the cowardly chief grabbed Robin and started to leave. Ah! He suddenly exclaimed as he remembered he hadn't given the orders yet. He turned around and ran back to the balcony. He pointed at his assassins group. You guys. He yelled. Go and pulverize the pirates on this Tower of Justice. You have permission to kill. He looked at the strongest of the group. Lucci. He yelled. You come with me. You need to protect me, got that? He returned to the room. Lucci followed behind him. Hunkfried. He yelled. The quite literal elephant in the room came running towards him. Then, he stopped. Sweat started pouring down his whole body. What is it? Spandam yelled at his pet sword. The elephant took a step back. Chief. Kaku said softly. What? Spandam yelled loudly, quite irritated. After receiving no response, he proceeded to turn around. Lucci and Robin did the same. In the empty air in front of them was the pirate captain. Kicking the air below him with his right foot. Looking displeased. Hello there. He said in a low tone. At that moment, Spandam felt cold sweat crawling down his spine. The man felt that maybe, just maybe, he shouldn't have done what he did as chief of the CP9. He glanced at the members of his organization. A few of them seemed to feel the same as he could see some sweat pouring down their faces. Luffy Robin whispered, but everyone heard her as there was dead silence. Only the wind would occasionally blow past them. Or a distant shout from the island. The pirate landed silently on the stone railing of the balcony. He looked at every member of the organization separately, sizing them up. The chief backed away a bit as the pirate rested his eyes on him, and when he did, he released a light chuckle, which sounded chilling in the silence. Then he looked at Robin. She flinched a bit. The kiss was fine. He said slowly. Her eyes widened in surprise at his words. But the cuffs, not so much. She looked down in shame. It may have seemed the only way at the time, but even if she was forced to do it, she couldn't help but regret her obviously low move. He looked away from her and she let out a breath. The pirate turned his attention back to the group. Jabber growled. What is this? He thought as he gritted his teeth in anger. I'm supposed to be the predator here. He looked at the pirate. He's even a little runt. He thought. Then why do I feel so intimidated? Luffy sighed. So you stupid amateurs are the ones who kidnapped our archaeologist. He said in a dangerously low voice. You shouldn't have done that. Luffy observed the members of the government's assassins group. Most of them seemed quite unnerved by his presence, especially given how easily he had followed them up there. Lucci and Kaku seemed to be the most calm of the group. Lucci wore a small smirk, while Kaku just observed him. The other members were more nervous, with sweat pouring down some of their faces. The elephant in the room was backing away slowly. His instinct seemed to tell him not to mess with a newly arrived person. He was easily the most scared of everyone, followed closely by the weakling chief, who had sweat pouring down his face. After all, the chief had always thought the CP9 were invincible. To a smaller degree, the members themselves believed that, but they were nowhere near as sure in it as him. So for a non-CP9 individual to arrive using one of their signature moves shook him. Especially given how nonchalant the pirate was about the whole thing. The pirate jumped down from the railing and lightly landed in front of them. The chief shook his head and quickly recomposed himself. CP9. He yelled. Stop him. He turned to leave. Lucci, you come with me. He ordered as his chosen bodyguard was still staring at the pirate. The strongest assassin rolled his eyes and followed with a disappointed expression. The chief grabbed Robin. The other assassins turned towards the pirate. Luffy didn't acknowledge them at all. He kicked the ground several times and appeared in front of the retreating trio. Who said you could leave? He asked in a low tone. Spandam's eyes nearly bulged out. Lucci. He yelled panicked. The assassin threw a punch at his head, but Luffy easily blocked it with his right hand, also powering the rejectile underneath his glove. Let go of Robin. He said calmly, but the undertone suggested pain upon failing to comply with his demand. Why should I? The chief stuttered, trying to look defiant, but failing at it. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Well, I could cook you. He suggested in a more cheerful tone. I've never eaten panda meat before. What? He stuttered out and unintentionally let go of her. The pirate stepped towards Robin. Are you okay? He asked her quietly. She nodded in confirmation. Then Luffy noticed something on her face. He stepped closer with a concerned look and examined it. He touched her cheek lightly with his index finger while she stared at him. You're bruised. He said quietly. Spandam started sweating. The pirate turned to the chief. Knowing what he was probably about to do and in accordance with his orders, he stepped in front of the chief. Get going. The assassin yelled to his comrades. Deal with the others. I want to fight this one. Lucci. Spandam yelled in protest, but the assassin ignored him. Luffy took another step forward and glared at Lucci. The message was clear. Very obvious. Get out of my way so I can kick your boss ass. Or something to that effect. He stretched his right arm behind him and punched forward. Lucci met the punch with his own. Because Luffy was holding back and didn't use any haki, the force was more or less equal, so both stayed where they were, although Lucci's strain was somewhat more visible. Luffy raised his left leg and quickly did a Rankyaku attack. Lucci's eyes widened, but he reacted fast enough with his right leg to redirect the flying blade somewhere in the air, however at that same moment Luffy punched his side with his left fist, sending him flying in the wall to the right. It was a very light punch for Luffy, only meant to clear the way. In front of him, Spandam stood panicked. Luffy walked up to the chief and looked at him. Lucci, as well as the other CP9, who still haven't left yet due to the conflict of orders, looked at him in confusion. The strongest CP9 member would have helped Spandam, but he didn't know what to make of Luffy's lack of reaction. The chief and Robin were confused also. Robin blinked a few times. Chief's eyes were wide and he stared back at the enemy. Then, suddenly. You bastard. Luffy yelled and delivered a painful-looking kick to Spandam's crotch that sent him flying towards the ceiling. The two women's eyes were wide, while all the men wore a nearly identical expression, with one of their eyes closed and face contorted in pain. Gabra's face in particular also showed some disgust. What kind of a man you are to aim for another man's weak spot like that? He yelled in anger. Luffy blinked. What kind of a man is he to beat a defenseless cuffed prisoner? He asked in return and looked up that man stuck with his head in the ceiling. Robin couldn't help but stare at Luffy. Nobody had ever avenged her like that. Even if it was with a completely shameless crotch shot. You could have just punched him. Kaku suggested while he eyed the chief. Surprisingly, there was no blood visible. It seemed the chief was more durable than they thought. Yoyoi. The largest person watching from the balcony exclaimed loudly. Aiming for another man's kantama shames a man. Luffy rolled his eyes in irritation. I get it. He yelled in an annoyed voice. He sighed. Tell you what. The pirate continued. In return, one of you can kick me in the same spot. There was silence for a moment. Oh, you'll probably break your leg if you do. He muttered afterwards. Everyone stared at him. Enough of this. Someone yelled from nearby. Go deal with the others. Fine. Jabra said in an angry voice. While he couldn't go against Lucci's order, he didn't have to pretend that he liked it. The others didn't comment on it. Everyone used to Geppo to jump in the air and in a moment they were gone, although Luffy wasn't particularly impressed with their speed. Luffy turned to his opponent. Robin was already looking at him. So? Luffy began. Key please. Lucci snorted. Even if I had it, I wouldn't give it to you. He said amused. Luffy eyed Spandam. The chief doesn't have it either. Luffy looked around the room. The elephant was looking at him in horror from the doorway. He blinked a few times. Was he that scary when he was mad? One of the other CP9 has it. The strongest assassin said. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Well, 4 of you were at Water 7, right? He asked. The chief fell from the ceiling with a thud, but everyone ignored him. He stayed on the ground, looking like he had some sort of spasm attack. And the strongest members after you are Kaku and that wolf guy. Lucci blinked. How did the pirate know that Jabber had a wolf devil fruit? Or was he just going off Jabber's normal appearance? The wolf guy wasn't with you, which makes me believe that Kaku has the key. Luffy finished. The assassin stared at him in shock. That was completely correct. The pirate didn't know about multiple keys aimed to waste their time, but he was still right about the key to Robin's handcuffs. Robin was surprised as well. Looking at Lucci's expression, it seemed that her captain guessed correctly. Then Lucci smirked. In any case, it won't do you any good. He said. After all, you'll have to defeat me. Luffy blinked a few times. Ooh, how scary. Luffy said sarcastically in a perfect impression of Admiral Kizaru. The assassin's face changed from amusement to anger. He did not like being mocked. Robin, can you go out of the way? Luffy asked. The archaeologist nodded and ran to the chief's office table. He kicked the helpless chief to the doorway, where he could be reunited with his pet sword. Lucci then smirked again as Luffy's attention was upon him. He used his devil fruit to transform into his own leopard hybrid form. He slowly grew in his form until he towered above the man. The man, who was picking his nose and looked at him with an unimpressed expression. The assassin resisted the urge to face fault. That was not a reaction he was expecting. Nevertheless, he lunged forward with his right fist, aiming a punch. Luffy simply jumped in the air. The leopard activated his tech eye as his opponent delivered a kick from above. It wasn't a particularly strong kick on Luffy's part, but it nearly broke through his defense. He quickly turned around and attempted to use a Shigan on his airborne opponent, but the pirate simply kicked his hand away with his foot. He kicked beneath him and used Geppo to get closer to his opponent. Renkyaku. He announced and sliced the air as soon as he was on the same height as his enemy. Luffy smirked and used his left hand to deflect the blade. Lucci was surprised, but he didn't let it show. He lunged forward and went into the offensive. He attempted several punches, which his opponent avoided, and then aimed a Shigan with both of his index fingers. Luffy grabbed both of his wrists and prepared his leg. Lucci used Tech Eye, but he soon discovered that his enemy was not going for a kick, but a Rankyaku instead, so he used his Geppo to get jump higher in the air, forcing Luffy to release his hands at the same time. The pirate was now below him, but he started running toward him in an attempt to attack. He smirked and used both of his legs to release several flying blades towards his enemy, which Luffy deflected, all but the last one, which cut through the side of his Hawaiian shirt but was unable to touch his body. Luffy stretched his right hand behind him. Gomu Gomu no pistol. He announced and punched forward towards his enemy. His punch was met with his opponent's, who was pushed back a bit. Damn it. Lucci thought. He's strong. Far stronger than I thought. Even in this form, he still overpowers me. Strain was visible on his face as the two fists were locked in a contest of strength. His opponent had no such problem, but the contest was cancelled when Luffy suddenly pulled back his fist, grabbed his sword and slashed forward, releasing a powerful flying blade attack, which Lucci barely avoided by jumping in the air and nearly hitting the ceiling. The assassin growled in anger. His opponent sheathed his katana and grinned mockingly. The thought reached his mind. He turned to the right, where the chief's table and Robin was. He smirked. Renkyaku. He yelled and released several compressed air blasts towards her, aimed to kill. Luffy, upon seeing this, used his top soarer speed and ran in front of the flying blades with his unsheathed sword. He started deflecting them. Even as he was doing so, Lucci ran towards him with an extended index finger on his right hand. As soon as he deflected the last slash, he was forced to dodge the Shigan by moving his head. At the exact same time as he dodged, he used his other hand and tried to pierce Luffy's body with another finger pistol. His opponent pulled his body back with flexibility impossible for a non-rubber man and dodged the strike. Then, Lucci raised his left leg. Renkyaku. He announced and sliced the air. Luffy barely dodged a slash as it was in close proximity and his body was in an odd position. It grazed the rubber body a bit, making a small cut at his side. The assassin smirked upon dealing his first damage to his enemy. Then, at the same time, the ground started shaking a bit. The two fighters didn't notice this as they were both in the air, but Robin did. What's happening? She yelled in surprise. Both of the fighters blinked and looked at her, wondering what was going on. Then they landed on the ground again. Now they knew what she was talking about. Luffy blinked in confusion. Lucci sighed. Haku must have cut the tower somewhere, he said in irritation. Luffy blinked a few times. He couldn't think of any good reason why the assassin would destroy his own home, but it did feel like it was sliding off. Is he dumb? He asked after a moment. Lucci looked at him but didn't respond. He might have pondered the same question. The assassins weren't particularly worried about collateral damage, but this was the direct property of the government, not to mention their home between mission. There was bound to be a lot of damage during the fights, but cutting the tower was utterly unnecessary. The assassin let the matter go and thought about the fight. While he was the first to deal damage, he couldn't be particularly pleased about the battle. His opponent seemed quite a bit faster than him. Luckily, there was a solution to that. He sighed. Seimin Kaiken, life return. He announced and he transformed. His hybrid form became less bulky and therefore allowed him more speed. It was already obvious that his enemy was stronger than him, seeing how much effort it took for him to counter punches and how little of it was visible on his enemy. If he needed more strength, he could just switch to the other form, but the enemy was physically stronger in either case. They were about to start fighting again when they heard the chief dragging himself across the floor. "You bastards," he hissed. "Don't think you're getting out of here alive." He chuckled and sat himself against the wall. "Lucci, you were supposed to protect me," he spat out after a while. With one hand he was clutching his manhood, while with his other he was rummaging through his pockets. Luffy's closed one of his eyes. His other eye was kept focused at the man's crotch. "Maybe I overdid it just a tiny bit," he thought. But then, when the man took out the object he was searching for, namely the golden den mushi, he shook his head several times. "No, I should have kicked harder," he thought. "No, you can't," Robin yelled from next to the table. The chief let out a sinister chuckle. "Oh, really?" he asked in a low tone. "Why not?" Luffy rolled his eyes. His right hand went into his right pocket. Robin noticed this and looked at his pocket in confusion, wondering why he did that. "Would you really do this, Spanda?" he asked him. "Would you sacrifice 10,000 Marines and possibly your spies just to make sure we don't escape?" The man looked at him with a sinister-looking grin. Luffy wondered how such a pathetic weakling could be so malicious. He hated both Akainu and Blackbeard, but they at least had the strength to actually challenge him, unlike the slimy panda bastard. "I don't care about the soldiers," he spat out. "They failed to stop you, so they are worthless to me." He panted a bit. "I'll get my promotion, Straw Hat Luffy," he continued in a malicious tone. 10,000 is a good sacrifice for my promotion." Luffy sighed. What an idiot. He then pressed the button, much to Robin's shock. He started cackling and made his great crawling escape. Luffy smirked as he looked at his pathetic form on the floor. "Boy, Spanda," he yelled in an almost singing voice. He took something from his right pocket. The chief turned around with a horrible feeling in his gut. Luffy allowed a great big mocking smirk to spread across his face. Everyone recognized what was in his hand. He clicked the button on the center of the device. "Would you really do this, Spanda? Would you sacrifice 10,000 Marines and possibly your spies just to make sure we don't escape?" "I don't care about the soldiers. They failed to stop you, so they are worthless to me." "I'll get my promotion, Straw Hat Luffy. 10,000 is a good sacrifice for my promotion." Luffy grinned as the chief looked at him and the tone dial in total shock. "Thank you Spanda," he said cheerfully as Spandam started stuttering random words like he was a madman. He chuckled. "I could kill you or beat you up," he continued. "But giving this to Monkey D. Garp would be much worse, wouldn't it?" The chief paled. "Grandpa doesn't like jerks like you either," Luffy finished. If possible, his face paled even further. "GG Grandpa," he stuttered out. Lucci seemed equally shocked. Luffy just grinned. "Now you'll never get your promotion," he said with his trademark grin. "You should never have messed with me, you know." He then turned his attention away from the stuttering chief and back to Lucci. Robin just stared at him in shock, hardly believing what she had seen. He intentionally did what would hurt Spandam the worst, she thought. Just as the two were about to fight again, they were once again interrupted. This time by a yelling panda who was running straight for Luffy. The pirate allowed the punch to connect to his jaw. It failed to move him even a little bit. Nevertheless, Spandam, in his fury, continued to punch him. When he had enough of him, Luffy simply knocked him out with a simple punch to the gut. Lucci looked at his chief in indifference. He was a fool and had brought this on himself. "Now, can we continue our fight?" Luffy asked and grinned. The assassin was surprised. The pirate's attitude towards him was almost warm compared to his attitude to the chief. He might have been smiling the whole time, but the change in the air was visible from before. "We need to tell the others to evacuate," Robin yelled from the table. Luffy nodded. "You do that," he told her. She wanted them to stop fighting temporarily and she was just about to suggest that, but when she saw Lucci's focused expression, she knew nothing had changed for him. She was going to have to warn them herself, however much harder it was with the cuffs. She could only hope their battle wouldn't last much longer. Both of the fighters used their Soru and vanished from her sight. Thank you for watching the last part of this amazing fanfic.